Hello everyone. Today we will study about the brainstem. This structure is known as brainstem. The brainstem consists of three parts. The superior part is known as midbrain, the middle part is known as pons, and the inferior part is known as medulla oblongata. This is the superior part and this is the anterior part of midbrain, and this is the anterior surface of pons, and this is the anterior surface of medulla oblongata. This is the posterior surface of midbrain. On the posterior surface of midbrain, we can see two colliculi, two superior colliculi and two inferior colliculi. And on the posterior surface of pons and medulla oblongata, we can see a rhomboid-like structure. This is known as rhomboid fossa or the fourth ventricle. The floor of the fourth ventricle is present on the dorsal surface of pons and medulla oblongata, and its roof is formed by the ventral surface of cerebellum. So this is the posterior surface of pons and medulla oblongata. So now we will study about the midbrain. This surface is known as midbrain. It is the superior part of brainstem. These two structures, this is the anterior part of midbrain, and these two structures are known as crus cerebri. And between the two crus cerebri, we can see a fossa. This fossa is known as peduncular fossa. And posterior to crus cerebri, we can see a dark color structures. We can see two dark color structures. These two dark color structures are known as substantia nigra. These colors are dark because there a lot of nucleus are tightly packed. So that is why the color of substantia nigra is dark. Posterior to substantia nigra, this structure is known as tegmentum of midbrain. From substantia nigra to cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius, the complete structure is known as tegmentum. And this foramen-like structure, it is known as cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. The function of this cerebral aqueduct is it drains the cerebral spinal fluid from third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. And the most posterior part of midbrain is known as tectum. The tectum is present behind or posterior to cerebral aqueduct. This part is known as tectum. This is the posterior part of midbrain, and on the posterior part of midbrain we can see four colliculi, two superior and two inferior colliculi. The two superior colliculi, it regulates the vision reflexes, and the two inferior colliculi, they regulates the hearing reflex. Now the middle part. We will study about the pons, the middle part of midbrain. This structure is known as pons. It is square-like structure, and this is the anterior surface of pons, and this is the posterior surface of pons. On the posterior surface, we can see the cranial part of the fourth ventricle is present on the posterior surface of pons. And the caudal part of the fourth ventricle is present on the dorsal or the posterior surface of medulla oblongata. So this structure is known as pons. This is the ventral or the anterior surface of pons. On the anterior surface of pons, we can see small fissures and small transverse straight fibers we can see on the anterior surface of pons. And on the anterior surface of pons, we can see a sulcus. This sulcus, a middle sulcus which divides the pons into two halves. This sulcus is known as basilar sulcus because the basilar artery, it runs on this sulcus. And the anterior part of pons is also known as the basilar part, and the posterior part of pons is also known as the tegmentum part of pons. Now we will study about pons. This structure, the middle part of the brainstem, is known as pons. This is the anterior surface of pons, and this is the posterior surface of pons. The anterior surface of pons, you can see on the anterior surface of pons small fissures and small transverse straight fibers you can see on the ventral or the anterior part of pons. And on the anterior part of pons, you can see a middle sulcus. This middle sulcus, it divides pons into two parts. This middle sulcus is also known as the basilar part or the basilar sulcus, because the basilar artery, it runs on this sulcus. And the anterior part or the anterior surface of the pons is also known as the basilar surface, and the posterior surface of pons is also known as the tegmental surface of pons. This part is medulla oblongata, and the junction between pons and medulla oblongata is known as pontomedullary junction. From the pontomedullary junction, three cranial nerves origin. First, the sixth cranial nerve abducent, the seventh cranial nerve facial, and the eighth cranial nerve vestibulocochlear. These three cranial nerves, they origin from the pontomedullary junction. Now, the posterior part of pons. On the posterior surface of pons, we can see the fourth ventricle. The cranial part of the fourth ventricle, it covers the posterior part of the pons, and the caudal part of the fourth ventricle, it covers the posterior or the dorsal surface of medulla oblongata. So this is the cranial part of the fourth ventricle. And on this fourth ventricle, you can see a sulcus limitans, two sulcus limitans on each side. This is known as sulcus limitans. And above the sulcus limitans, you can see these two structures. These are known as locus ceruleus. The function of locus ceruleus is they regulate our sympathetic nervous system. And these two structures are known as superior fovea. From the superior fovea, trigeminal nerve and abducent nerve, the sensory part, two nerves origin. And medial to the abducent nerve, this area is known as facial colliculus. From this facial colliculus, facial nerve gets origin. And on the medial part of the fourth ventricle, you can see one sulcus. This sulcus divides the fourth ventricle into two medial half. Now comes to the inferior part of the brainstem. This part is known as medulla oblongata, the inferior part of the brainstem. This is the anterior surface of the brainstem, which is elevated, and this is the posterior surface of medulla oblongata. On the anterior surface of medulla oblongata, we can see on the middle part of the medulla oblongata, we can see a sulcus which divides the medulla oblongata into two medial half. And this sulcus is known as anteromedian sulcus, and this anteromedian sulcus, it continues with the anteromedian sulcus of the spinal cord, which is present below to medulla oblongata. And lateral to this anteromedian sulcus, we can appreciate two elevated like structures, and these two elevated like structures are known as pyramids of medulla oblongata. These two are the pyramids of medulla oblongata, which are present lateral to median sulcus. In pyramids, pyramidal nucleus are present, and on the superior part of the pyramid, the nucleus the fibers which comes from the pyramidal nucleus, they are straight, and when they goes into the lower part of the medulla oblongata, they cross each other, they decussate each other. And lateral to pyramid, we can see two more structures on each side. These two structures, elevated structures, these are known as olive. The sulcus between pyramids and olive, the anterolateral sulcus, on this anterolateral sulcus, hypoglossal nerve or the 12th cranial nerve, it gets origin. Lateral to olive, there is inferior cerebellar peduncle. Inferior cerebellar peduncle, it joins the medulla oblongata to cerebellum. It is present in cerebellum and it joins the medulla oblongata to cerebellum. Middle cerebellar peduncle, it is also present in cerebellum and it joins pons to cerebellum. Lateral to olivary nucleus, inferior cerebellar peduncle is present, and between olivary nucleus and inferior cerebellar peduncle we can see posterior lateral sulcus. On this posterior lateral sulcus, 3 cranial nerves get origin. 9th glossopharyngeal, 10th vagus and 11th spinal accessory. These 3 cranial nerves, they get origin from the posterior lateral sulcus. And now comes to the posterior surface of the medulla oblongata. This is the posterior surface of medulla oblongata. On the posterior surface of medulla oblongata, we can see the the caudal part of the fourth ventricle. This part is known as the caudal part of the fourth ventricle, which is present on the dorsal surface of the medulla oblongata. This surface, this is the caudal part of the fourth ventricle. And you can see one pen-like structure, needle of pen-like structure. This is known as calamus scriptorius. Lateral to calamus scriptorius, we can see 2 elevated like structures. These are known as gracilis fasciculus or the gracilis nucleus area, where gracilis nucleus are present. Lateral to gracilis nucleus or the gracilis fasciculus, we can see one more elevated structure. This is known as cunate fasciculus or the cunate area. The function of gracilis and cunate nucleus is they control our proprioception. Now, the fourth ventricle, the cranial part of the fourth ventricle, the caudal part of the fourth ventricle, which is present on the dorsal surface of the medulla oblongata. This part, the caudal part of the fourth ventricle. On the caudal part of the fourth ventricle, we can see hypoglossal trigone and vagal trigone. The superior part of the caudal part of the fourth ventricle, it consists of hypoglossal trigone, means the nucleus of the hypoglossal cranial nerve present over here, and below to it vagal trigone, means the nucleus of the 10th cranial nerve or the vagus nerve present over here. The superior part of the medulla oblongata is very broad and the inferior part of the medulla oblongata is very narrow, because the pyramidal fibers or the pyramidal nucleus which is present in the middle part of the medulla oblongata, the fibers which are running from the pyramidal nucleus, they are straight when they are in the superior part, but when they comes to the inferior part, they decussate or they cross each other. That's why the inferior part of the medulla oblongata is narrow, and the fibers, these pyramidal fibers, they enters into our spinal cord and they forms the lateral, and they cover the lateral area of the spinal cord. So thank you so much. This is all about the medulla oblongata and the brainstem.